Scipio was found dead, his body unmarked, with a notebook beside him which he had put to hand in the evening, intending to write that night a speech he was to give to a gathering of the public. There are some who say that slaves confessed under torture, that strangers were brought into the back of the house at night who strangled him, and that those who discovered this shrank from publicizing it because the people were still angry with Scipio and pleased at his death. Scipio, anyway, was dead. Well, this is Young Heretics, and that was the ancient murder mystery of Scipio Africanus the Younger, also known as Scipio Aemilianus. Appian, who is the major historian of this period, says that episode, notable in itself, was no more than a subsidiary incident in what's called the Gracchus disturbance, which is what we've been talking about now for 2 episodes on Young Heretics. That's how wild this thing was. The unsolvable murder mystery of a major public official and war hero. It's just kind of a thing that happened in passing during this insane time in Roman history. Today's episode of Young Heretics is about how things got to that point. So just to remind you for a second, last week we sort of left off in the middle of the Gracchus disturbance. It's called the Gracchus disturbance or the Gracchus period of Roman history because it's dominated by these 2 incredibly charismatic brothers, Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus. Last week was all about Tiberius Gracchus, whose sort of major contribution or major attempt to contribute to Roman political life was to restore a law that said nobody can have more than 500 jugera of conquered land. The Romans were expanding, especially they were interested to know what to do with their land in Italy. And they had this idea that you could have sort of small farms of 500 jugera, ancient Roman measurements, right? That's about half a square mile, as I said last week. So this incensed the rich, who had already been kind of sprawling out vastly into this territory, taking up vast tracts of land. They had already kind of entangled that land with their generational wealth, and it wasn't quite clear how to redistribute it. It was impossible really to do, but Tiberius just kept trying to ram it through despite kind of manifest impracticability and all sorts of opposition from the rich. The consequence of which was that the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, Cornelius Scipio Nassa, shamefully led an elite faction to kill Tiberius and many of his supporters, to club them to death. So that's where we left off. And that's not even half the story, right? So the question now is, so then what? Well, Tiberius had a brother. He had a brother named Gaius Gracchus. And Gaius was about 9 years younger than Tiberius. So after the whole Tiberius episode, which sort of begins around 133 BC and then stretches onward, we now move forward into the 120s BC and the ascendancy and doom of Gaius Gracchus, en route to which we lose our old pal Scipio Aemilianus, who is murdered in the night. So we're going to come back to this period of history again and again on this show, I can already tell, because I think it has tremendous resonance, tremendous sort of parallels with our current moment. The dynamics that happened at the end of the Republic in Rome are frighteningly similar to the dynamics of our American moment. I don't think that dooms us to the end of the American Republic, but I do think it means that it behooves us to be studying this period. I said before that this show is the classical education that you may well have been denied because our public education system and our universities and our academy are so dead, are so sort of full and choked with corrupt ideology that you may well not have been getting the kind of education that will shape your soul to understand the world that you live in and to contribute to it. That's what this show is about. That's why we are focusing now on this period, which is really the period that we need to know about in order to understand what's going on right now. The Romans thought of this period as the beginning of the end of the Republic, and eventually the sort of chain of events, civil unrest, civil war that would lead to the empire. Is the same true of us? That's what we're here to try and find out. Today's big idea, the thing that I'm going to try and draw out of the story of Gaius Gracchus is, in every society, men are going to be men, and if they have good outlets for that, then the world will go well. If the world is corrupt, and it only offers men bad outlets for their manhood and their masculinity or their manly impulses, whatever you want to call them, things will go badly. To me, that is one of the central lessons of this period in history. That's what I'm going to argue throughout this episode. So let's kind of jump into who this guy was, right? Gaius Gracchus was a different kind of guy than Tiberius altogether. He was not like his brother, although they were both wealthy, they were both tremendously well educated, they were both extremely beloved. As I said, they were charismatic. And remember, we're going here off of sort of two major sources with some other stuff thrown in. We've got Plutarch, who's a Greek essayist from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Plutarch likes to embellish. He likes to write narrative history, and so we have to take some of what he says with a grain of salt. But we also have Appian of Alexandria, who has his own problems, but during this period, he's really kind of our major narrative source. He writes slightly later, 2nd century AD. Plutarch and Appian, that's who we're dealing with. I'm going to read to you first now from Plutarch's comparison between the characters of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, these two brothers. Plutarch says Tiberius was gentle and sedate, while Gaius was high-strung and vehement, so that even when haranguing the people, the one, Tiberius, stood composedly in one spot, while the other, Gaius, was the first Roman to walk about upon the rostra and pull his toga off his shoulder as he spoke. So he's an incredibly animated and, in some cases, almost violent speaker. In the second place, the speech of Gaius was awe-inspiring and passionate to exaggeration, while that of Tiberius was more agreeable and more conducive to pity. We heard about this last week when I was talking about Tiberius' speech trying to convince his fellow tribune not to force himself to be deposed, basically. With the sort of tears and much supplication. That's Tiberius. But Gaius was persuasive and ornate. So also as regards their table and mode of life. Tiberius was simple and plain, while Gaius, although temperate and austere as compared with others, in contrast with his brother, was ostentatious and fastidious. Tiberius was reasonable and gentle, while Gaius was harsh and fiery, so that against his better judgment he was often carried away by anger as he spoke, raising his voice to a high pitch and uttering abuse and losing the thread of his discourse. So much more volatile is Gaius, much more of a powder keg than his brother, much greater potential for what you might call demagoguery, which we will get into as we go. But here's the last thing that Plutarch says, and this, to me, is utterly crucial. Tiberius, however, was 9 years older than his brother, and this set a different period of political activity of each, and more than anything else, vitiated their undertakings. What does this mean? Tiberius and Gracchus both had the makings of great men. They had dynamism, they had education, they had wealth, they had all forms of success that you could wish upon them, and they also had tremendous energy. I'm going to talk for just a moment about that energy, that sort of spirit that they have. But my point here is that it was the circumstances of their time which channeled those energies into destructive avenues rather than constructive avenues. The force and the power of great men is, in some senses, a morally neutral, although admirable force. You can have sort of great men who are shaped to great things and great men who are shaped to disastrous things. And as Plutarch suggests, Gaius especially, but also Tiberius, were shaped to disastrous things. Their manly energies were channeled in disastrous ways. What do I mean by that? Well, Tiberius and Gracchus both have an abundance of what the Greeks called thumos. Thumos means your chest or your heart or your spirit. It's something to do, we would call it maybe vitality these days, right? And it's an essential sort of manly virtue of energy, commitment, and drive. Thomas Aquinas also talks about this as kind of the essential, the core of manhood is this follow through or this passion to push your project to the end despite resistance. So briefly, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this on future episodes, Plato in his Republic, Book 4, thought about the soul, the human soul, in terms of three different parts. And this is going to sort of explain what thumos is and how thumos spirit works in the Greek and therefore also Roman understanding. So Aristotle would also kind of pick this up a little bit, although he's more complicated. We're going to get to Aristotle also at a later time. But here's Plato's sort of three parts of the soul. There's the Greek word for it is the epitheumatikon, which is the first part of the soul. And it's associated if you remember way back when we talked about Plato's Symposium, it's associated with that eros, with the kind of lust and just passionate desire. It's something that doesn't particularly respond to reason. It's just how your impulses work. In some cases, it's associated with your nature or the natural ways that you are driven. And that's why, of course, sexual desire is also sort of associated with this realm of the soul, this part of the soul. So that's kind of the lowest for Plato, kind of the lowest part of the soul. The highest part of the soul for Plato is the logistikon, which is from the Greek word logos meaning kind of thought, reason. Logic, of course, is the word that we get from this in English. The logos is in many cases, it's kind of the logic that undergirds the whole world. And our souls partake in that logic when we think and use reason and sort of theory and our higher reasoning faculties. So those are kind of the lowest and the highest part of Plato's three-part soul. But standing in between those parts, crucially, and we often forget this, mediating between your reason and your appetites or your kind of base desires is the thumos, which is, again, the heart or the chest or the spirit. And it's more than mere appetite. Anger is associated with it, noble rage. Every impulse that you have, I think, again, this is especially true for men, these kind of impulses that you have that in their raw form could both tear you apart and destroy everybody around you. But if channeled, it's kind of how you make yourself follow the dictates of logos. In many ways, your thumos is how you have self-control as well as how you get out of control, right? So reason tells you kind of which desires from the epitheumatikon, from this lower desiring part, which desires should I indulge, which should I restrain? And reason is how I kind of think through those things. But unless I have thumos, unless I have this energy or this spirit, I can't actually act on those dictates of reason. Thumos is like the handmaiden in the best souls. Thumos is like the handmaiden of reason. Here is why I think that this is the core. Thumos is kind of the core of manhood, right? People think a lot of the time when, especially now, we've been tricked in many cases by kind of radical feminism into thinking about manhood as pure appetite, pure desire, pure sort of lowest part of the soul. Or just, men just want to have sex and destroy everything. Like, look, of course, that is obviously part of, untutored and unrestrained manhood. But the core, to me, of true manhood and cultivated manhood is the thumos. Think back again to when we talked about C.S. Lewis and the abolition of man and men without chests. That is why, remember, Lewis was a classicist. That's why he talked about chests. The chest is your thumos, right? The men without chests are the men who know everything that you should do, but have no follow-through, have no sort of drive or inclination to actually stand by their guns, stick by their principles. This is the core of the ancient view of the soul. And it's also, to me, the core of kind of truly understanding what men are as a force in society. And Tiberius and Gaius both have this abundance of thumos. When a society is healthy, it accepts those kinds of men, as the lifeblood of the society. It takes their drive and their energy and channels it into its best institutions, into its politics, into its educational facilities, into all of the things that make up the kind of bones and the meat of a society. Thumos, manly energy, ambitious young men are the lifeblood of that society. When a society is dying, when it's in decay, it represses male thumos or undervalues it. It leads it into these perverted forms. This is why conservatives like me hate the idea of toxic masculinity, which tends often to sort of shade over into like all masculinity is toxic, right? The consequence of that, and you can see it on your street today if you walk outside, the consequence of that is dispirited men, and it's also corrupted men. It does not tame men to tell them that their manhood must be repressed. It just makes it bubble up in these weird and twisted ways. That is why Gaius and Tiberius turned out the way they did. It was because they were, not because they were inherently evil, but because they were so noble and had so much of this energy in such a dying society that they ended up destroying the world. Let's tell the story about how that happened. Before I do that, I'm just going to briefly pause and say thank you very much for listening to this show. It's great to have you here. It's been amazing to see all the reviews coming in and the downloads for this podcast. It's like incredible. Thank you. It's so much fun to be here with you. If you have not already, and if you are enjoying this show, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, whatever. And this really helps us. Leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, because that's tremendously exciting and helpful for the show. And at the very least, just keep your bad opinions to yourself. But okay, thank you. Thank you for being here. We are going to dive now into the story of how the world corrupted Gaius Gracchus. So the kind of thumos, the manly energy and spirit that I'm talking about living in Gaius and Tiberius, showed itself early on in life because both of them were hugely successful in the military. And not only were they great sort of fighters and leaders in the Roman military, but they burst the bonds of what was required for them. They kind of cheated at the edges of how the Roman military was supposed to be run. So you can already see them sort of overflowing the structures in which, the social structures in which they've been born. So, for example, we didn't talk about this when we talked about Tiberius, but on a campaign, when Tiberius was on a campaign in Numantia, which is Spain, this is sort of the Roman area of, it's a Roman name for an area of Spain. Tiberius negotiated a treaty with the leader of the Numantians, which saved 20,000 Roman lives. We won't get into that story, but it was a hugely important moment in that military campaign. He was not the consul, he was not the general when he negotiated that treaty, and he was basically stepping in because the Numantians would only deal with him, and the consul was kind of not the leader that they most trusted. And so there's an example where he sort of overstepped his bounds because there was this void in leadership, and it led him to destructively push against the kind of rules of the society and of the military. Military leaders will tell you that that is never a good thing, when in order to do the right thing, you also have to push against the way that the military is run. Gaius was the same way. He was brilliant, but a hothead. He went also as a young man to fight in Sardinia in 126 BC. Sardinia is a Mediterranean island to the west of Italy. And he did a fantastic job. He was sort of praised, but when the appointed time came, he wanted to go home because that, he had basically signed up for a period of military service. And he basically came home before his consul did, because his consul wanted to kind of like stay and languish in this sort of what for Gaius probably felt like a boondoggle. And Gaius probably wanted to be back at the center of Roman politics. Again, ambitious, successful young man being constrained in sort of in a sphere that's too small for him. He was accused of all sorts of things, of having conspired with Rome's enemies, with any number of sort of treasonous actions, but he acquitted himself. So this was again, another moment. Like Tiberius, Gaius had a period of kind of being in danger of very, very serious, perhaps even fatal censure by the Roman state, but made his way out of that to go on to have a political career. So that is where things really got ugly and also exciting. So remember that the Roman state here is founded on the will of the people. It's a popular sovereignty regime. The people meet in two separate bodies, one of which, the Comitia Centuriata, is sort of openly elitist and based on property and class. The other of which, the Comitia Tributa, or the Council of the Plebs, is sort of slightly more egalitarian. And that is where the tribunes of the plebs, 10 tribunes of the plebs, are elected every year. So those are sort of the two centers of power in Roman political life. But you also have a Senate, which is kind of the elder statesmen. Officially speaking, they have mostly advisory capacities, but in point of fact, the way the Roman state is run, they tend to be much more powerful and active. However, also remember that at this point, the Senate is lazy, sluggish, and in many cases, quite contemptible. Not that there aren't good people in the Senate, but that this kind of body has become more source of sclerosis and blockage of kind of keeping people from doing what they need to be doing than anything else. if this sounds familiar to you, you are on the right track, right? We also are famous for lamenting on both sides of the political aisle what you would call the gridlock in American society, right? The gridlock of our legislators, which causes all sorts of, that one failure, that failure of legislatures to legislate, causes all sorts of contortions in other areas of our political life, like the fact that our judiciary is basically out there making laws, which is, again, another famous complaint about American legal and political proceedings. The same fundamental problem exists at this point in the Roman Senate. Inaction, sluggishness, bunch of kind of old dudes trying to protect their own personal interests more than they're trying to help along the growth of the Roman state. So Gaius, when Tiberius passes his law, which, remember, is about the redistribution of land, giving land back, basically trying to give land back to the middle class, make it possible for them to have kids again, make it possible for them to have a future, and so forth. But it's impossible to actually do. Gaius, poor schmuck, is entrusted with the task of enacting this Tiberian law. So while Tiberius is alive, he and his brother both are kind of involved in this. And then after Tiberius dies, the law is still in effect. And the council includes Gaius, Appius Claudius, who is the princeps senatus, kind of like elder statesman, Fulvius Flaccus, whom we'll meet a little bit later, and this other guy, Papirius Carbo. So together, these guys are tasked with accomplishing an impossible task. They really, it's an all-out nightmare to redistribute land. And in fact, it's not just a nightmare because the rich are being obstructionist. We talked mostly last week about the fact that the rich are kind of getting in the way. But this law is also disenfranchising some of the people it's supposed to enfranchise, because when you start rearranging territory, you have to take it from whoever is kind of currently farming it and give it to another person, even if you're going to sort of recompense that original holder with other land. And so people are saying, well, the land that you took from me actually had, it was much more arable, had much more kind of potential for agriculture, and now you're giving me this kind of barren land, or all of this stuff is going on. And the Italian farmers who are just trying to get by are starting to get incredibly incensed. So here's what happens. I'm going to read to you Appian's sort of account of this part of the story. And here it is. So he says, not all owners had kept their contracts of sale or titles of allotment, and such as were actually discovered were inconclusive. So that's even worse, right? The records are basically all in a mess. When it was resurveyed, some people were displaced to bare land from land that had been planted with trees and equipped with farm building, and others from cultivated land to land that was uncultivated or marshy or liable to flooding, right? So this is just like a disaster and a nightmare. And what happens next? All this then, and the haste with which judgments were given on these disputes, were more than the Italians could bear, and they chose Cornelius Scipio, who had sacked Carthage, to be spokesman for their grievances. Because he had found them extremely supportive in the wars, he was reluctant to ignore their request, so he went to the Senate. And although he did not openly attack Gracchus' law because of the common people, he examined its problems in detail and proposed that the legal actions should be heard not by the land commissioners, so not by this council that includes Gaius, since they were regarded as prejudiced by the litigants, but by others. So this guy, Scipio Aemilianus, he's usually called, is the adoptive grandson of Rome's greatest Republican war hero. Scipio Africanus the Elder beat Hannibal, the Carthaginian invader, at the Battle of Zama, and it was a huge turning point for Roman history. His grandson, Scipio, also called Africanus, but Scipio Aemilianus, we call him to distinguish him, basically razed Carthage to the ground, sacked Carthage, and kind of turned the tide from, well, Carthage is kind of a threat to Rome is just obliterating its enemies. And this was a big moment of expansion, a big part of the kind of process that we are talking about, the process of Roman expansion beyond the territory that even it, kind of in its wildest dreams, had initially conceived itself as living in. So they give the job of kind of adjudicating this problem to Scipio Africanus, or Scipio Aemilianus. And he basically punts. I mean, he says, look, I'm not going to just tell you to repeal this law, But this, and this are the intractable problems. And at least we shouldn't have basically the same guys that pushed the law. We shouldn't have those guys also enacting and enforcing the law. Pretty sound principle, but also a huge problem for the people, for the kind of real hardcore Gracchans, the people that just want this law enacted no matter what. And so Scipio is going to sort of propose this change, and that is what happens right before the thing that I read at the very beginning of this episode. So I'm going to read that again now that we know kind of what's going on, right? The people listened to these allegations and were apprehensive until Scipio was found dead, his body unmarked, with a notebook beside him, which he had put to hand in the evening, intending to write that night a speech he was to give to a gathering of the public. So Scipio is axed. He's out. And there's all these conjectures. I didn't read all of these at the beginning. So now let's kind of go into them. There's all these conjectures about who killed him. Perhaps, as some think, he took his own life in the realization that he was incapable of carrying out what he had undertaken. So maybe the task was just so daunting that he despaired. Or there are some who say that slaves confessed under torture that strangers were brought into the back of the house at night who strangled him, and that those who discovered this shrank from publicizing it because the people were still angry with Scipio and pleased at his death. Another option, perhaps Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, killed him to prevent the repeal of Gracchus' law, assisted in the deed by her daughter Sempronia, who was married to Scipio, but on account of her ugliness and childlessness, neither was loved by nor loved. So, okay, yikes, Scipio is out. But as Appian says, right, that's not even the biggest, the most exciting thing that happens in this whole story. It's kind of like a thing that happens en route to everything. And the next, almost actually the preface to the main event, which is that is what, once that episode is over, Gaius comes on the scene. And he's kind of been quiet this whole time. He has, in some sense, receded from public life. I mean, the death of his brother was obviously very traumatic, but I think in general, he's like laying low, trying to figure out where everything stands. Cicero, remember the great Roman statesman whom I mentioned and talked about on our July 4th special, lives a little bit later than Gaius and Tiberius. Cicero says that it was because Tiberius came to Gaius in a dream and said that they had the same political fate. And this was serious in antiquity. We kind of tend to dismiss this like superstition, but people took dreams seriously. They considered them portals to some connection with the divine, and they believed seriously that the gods had a hand in how things were going and had a will and desire that you actually couldn't really escape. So it's quite possible that this is part of the decision, but of course also I think Gaius notices that the moment is now expedient for him to step onto the stage and take things in hand. And so in 123 BC, Gaius is elected tribune of the plebs overwhelmingly. He's one of the 10 tribunes for that year. And at this point, all bets are kind of off. Like, Rome has already erupted into political violence. Tiberius himself, who was more mild-mannered than Gaius, and who proposed a pretty mild version of the land redistribution law, at least initially, Tiberius himself has been stymied at every point and eventually killed. And the stuff that Gaius starts proposing is basically like a rewriting of the Roman constitution. I mentioned Mommsen, quoted him at the end of the previous episode. This is kind of this great German historian of Rome in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he says, Mommsen says that Gaius' reforms were nothing else than an entirely new constitution. This is also something that has resonance with our time. You may have heard, if you kind of watch political commentary, you may have heard a lot of talk about second or third constitutions in America. And in many cases, the sort of new constitution that people are talking about has already come into being. One big sort of flashpoint for that is people think that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 kind of created a new set of rules and laws, especially about freedom of association in this country. Even before that, the Civil War is thought, and Lincoln is thought to have kind of changed the game and how the states relate to one another and to the Union overall. So America, too, has gone through periods of radical legislation and radical upheaval that have resulted in what some people consider kind of just a total change in our basic and fundamental way of living together in our Constitution. So we're certainly dealing with at least that here, and probably with something even a little bit more radical and extreme in Gaius. Because the first thing that he does is he proposes and enacts grain rations for everybody. It's a UBI, it's a universal basic income, right? He says, basically the people are being disenfranchised, so we're going to take public funds and we're just going to give people food. We're just going to give people grain. And Appian says that now he has the people in his pay. That's how he describes it, which tells you something, and this is often a suspicion that I have also about people who propose UBI, is that even if there are kind of interesting arguments to be had about how public funds should be distributed, it's almost never about that. It's almost always about, in exchange for this, sort of subsistence and this sort of living wage or what have you, in exchange for that, you are now going to you're going to rely on me for your livelihood. And that's what's so galling about it, right? Ultimately, all of this stuff, the talk about the dignity of work, talk about the kind of the future of just human endeavor on this planet and in this country, is not about anything other than whom do you rely upon. And people that are like me, who are disgusted by the idea of relying upon like big daddy government for a UBI, are appalled by these kinds of measures. So that's the first thing that Gaius does. And Appian seems to suggest that he's doing it at least in part out of ambition and out of a will to gratify the people who are kind of coming more and more behind him, becoming more and more his basis of power. And then the next thing that happens as a result of that, as a result of the popular power that's behind Gaius, he gets reelected for the next year. And again, remember, that is not illegal, but it's highly unusual. It's kind of, it would make anybody antsy about the amount of power, popular support and power that somebody is accruing to himself. That Gaius is reelected in this next year. And it's a big deal. And an even bigger deal is what he does next. So the next sort of reform he does is he changes who hears and judges law cases, litigation, and courts. So he rearranges, typically the Senate in Rome hears litigation and makes decisions about legal cases. There is terrible corruption in this system. This is why it's vulnerable to this kind of radical change, is because the senators are taking bribes left and right, basically. And they're very embarrassed about that. It's very embarrassing when you're kind of the people who are at the highest places in your political life are visibly corrupt. It's kind of shameful to the whole polity, including the people taking the bribes when they're discovered. And that is why the Senate basically rolls over when what Gaius does is he puts the equestrian class, which is kind of an intermediary between the highest of the high and the kind of general populace. The equestrian class is like, they're sometimes called the knights of the Roman Republic. They are basically installed as a new court, as a new law court. And this, of course, fixes nothing. In fact, it makes it worse because the equestrian class also is taking bribes. In many cases, they're kind of in Gaius' pocket. And so that's just another sort of area now of Roman political life that Gaius has sort of under his sway. He now controls the popular vote. He now controls the courts. And if you're anybody with any kind of concern for distribution of power in the Roman state, you're getting very, very antsy at this point. I think there's an interesting parallel here with a guy called Ibram X. Kendi in the modern day, who is famous for his book Stamped from the Beginning. It's kind of the most extreme version of the like quote unquote anti-racism movement. This idea that all of America is stamped from the beginning, is just inherently racist and anti-black. And one of the things that Kendi does is he says we should create a department of anti-racism, and he believes in actual constitutional amendments to make these kinds of changes, right? He says there should be a department of anti-racism that roots out racism in every level of political life. taking control of the courts, taking control of the adjudication of law, the decision about who gets punished and who doesn't, is a major abrogation of the distribution of powers. It changes the way that things work in a state. So that's another thing that Gaius has now done to kind of make people antsy. And he builds a ton of roads, which is an interesting one, right? Infrastructure. And again, compare here the New Deal, right? This sort of public works administration in 1933, when this sort of solution to the Great Depression was just to build a bunch of stuff. And that kind of, again, puts a bunch of, has a benefit, which is that it alleviates the poverty. It has a downside, which is that it puts people in the pocket of the government. And so that too is happening now sort of under Gaius. And the next thing that he wants to do, and this has been floated before, is he wants to give full citizenship and therefore the vote to Italian males over 17. Because remember, in Rome, all Roman citizen males over 17 can vote. And what's called the allies and the people kind of in these surrounding conquered territories, or people who are living as subsidiaries of the Roman state, those people have, some relationship to the Roman state. In many cases, they fight in Roman wars and so forth, but they do not yet have the vote. And long after Gaius Gracchus is dead, there's going to be more turbulence on this front, because people are kind of demanding to have their voices heard in the Roman state as the Roman state becomes a bigger and bigger thing. But right now, what Gaius wants is he wants to give these guys the vote, because then they'll vote for him, right? Which is another common ploy, right? This is something that Democrats especially are often accused of, is wanting there to be more immigration, not because they believe in the kind of multicultural goodness of the whole thing and the warm fuzzies of it all, but because those people will be grateful to the people that let them in and vote for them. Now, again, leaving aside your kind of current American politics, the only thing to observe here is that the functional dynamic of this is to make Gaius Gracchus more and more powerful, right? What do all of these things have in common? They have a little bit of concern for the poor in common, right? But they also have in common the fact that they make Gaius the dude in charge. And that is not an accident. Appian kind of tells us that these are a succession of acts of whetting and satisfying Gaius Gracchus' ambition. Again, that ambition has been thwarted and frustrated time and again by a decrepit Roman state. So I'm not just saying here, right, like the kind of, conservative argument is to be like, oh, these stupid tyrants, they're evil and they just want all the power, right? That is not the argument that I'm making here. The argument that I'm making is this guy could have been one of the great Roman statesmen, but Rome was already kind of broken. And so he basically became a megalomaniac. And the closest thing, there were kind of rumblings of this in Tiberius' life. There was one episode that we didn't talk about that I'm just going to briefly mention here because it's an interesting precursor to all of this. Adolescent III, the king of Pergamum, which is in Asia Minor, now Turkey. Adolescent III died and left his whole inheritance to Rome. All his wealth and his kingdom went to Rome. Tiberius saw this happen and said, you know what, let's just give that all to the people that are going to be farming these new parcels of public land. As we redistribute wealth, we will also invest in people's farming with these subsidies from this big chunk of wealth. Now, again, you can debate the merits of that proposition. It actually is kind of a moot point, because what happened really in Pergamum is that the Rome got embroiled in another foreign war. Aristonicus, who was the sort of illegitimate son of Attalus' predecessor, basically didn't accept that Attalus could give away all of this wealth to Rome, and so Rome just ended up in a war with them. But, the point of it just here is that this is kind of the direction that things are moving. This idea, well, let's just give wealth, the wealth that the Roman state accrues, let's just give it directly to the people. And there's merits to that impulse. But when there's only one guy doing it over and over again, it's a recipe for some form of tyranny. Or at least what you call demagoguery, right? Leadership of the people that kind of caters to all their worst and basest impulses. What happens next? This is important. What happens next is the Senate catches wise. So the Senate figures out that the way the wind is blowing is we've got all this sort of popular energy, all this frustration, all this desire to do something about the sorry economic state of the middle class in Rome. And they see that both Tiberius and now Gaius have been smart and successful at actually kind of listening to those people and representing them in order to gain their support and therefore their power. The Senate can play at that game too. And in fact, they do. They sort of set up their own version of this dynamic. They set up their own demagogue in this guy Livius Drusus, who is another tribune, but he's kind of in the pocket of the senatorial interests, the senatorial elite. And Drusus just vetoes Gracchus citizenship laws. And you can do this in Rome, right? If you have a person of equal standing or lower standing, you can just say, nope, like we're not going to do this. He doesn't even argue for it, doesn't give a reason, he just vetoes this stuff. And this is everything because Gaius can't move forward. He's totally frustrated. And in addition, Livius says, you know what? We're going to have 12 shiny new colonies, which is very exciting for all these people that want land, right? People that have been deprived of land, that have legitimate concern that they're being kind of like cheated out of their birthright. It's like, well, you know what? We're just going to expand outward. This is what I said at the beginning of the end rather of the last episode is like, the victory will go to the person that recognizes you need more land, not to relitigate the old land. And so Livius Drusus, at the kind of, request of the Senate, figures this out. He's like, aha, here's what I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you more space to live in. Again, there are merits to that. Also, however, it's kind of a bread and circuses game. It's kind of just now like who can give the people the better thing. That's, and it works. Gaius kind of falls out of popular favor. He stops being the people's go-to guy. And he is sent to one of the new colonies by the Senate, which is just kind of a way of getting rid of him. So along with his buddy, Fulvius Flaccus, whom I mentioned earlier, he was one of the people, he was consul, and then he kind of served on the redistribution council that got scuppered with Scipio, all that stuff. Fulvius Flaccus, the buddy of Gaius, and he is now, he becomes tribune, and they sail to Africa to found this colony. It's kind of a dud. There's all sorts of bad omens. There are all sorts of problems with doing this. And basically Gaius is once again thwarted and frustrated, and a fight breaks out. So this part is so dramatic, again, that as before, I'm just going to read you Appian's account. A note, by the way, this is John Carter's translation of the Penguin Classics one. Really nice, really clean translation of the Greek. So, okay. Having lost his preeminence as a popular leader, Gracchus sailed to Africa. He was accompanied by Fulvius Flaccus, who had been chosen tribune after his consulship because of these projects. It had been voted to establish a colony in Africa, as the place had a reputation for fertility, and these very men had been deliberately chosen to set it up so that they should be away from Rome for a little while, and the Senate might have some rest from demagoguery. So this is, as I said, this is kind of a way of getting rid of them. It's a disaster, right? Those who were still engaged on the surveying in Africa reported that wolves had torn up and scattered the boundary markers placed by Gracchus and Fulvius, and the augurs declared that the settlement was ill-omened. Gracchus and Fulvius, maddened by their impending failure here too, alleged that the Senate had lied about the wolves. The boldest of the plebeians lent them their support and brought daggers with them to the capital, where the assembly concerning the colony was going to take place. So once again, as before in the case of Tiberius, what's going on here is people are starting to read the tea leaves and they're saying this is not actually something that's going to be peaceably fixed. And now there's precedent for it. Now we know that this is something that can happen. So people are arming themselves. There's an escalation of hostility and mistrust among these different factions of the Roman people. The people had already gathered, and Fulvius had begun to speak about the business when Gracchus arrived on the capital attended by a bodyguard of his sympathizers. Conscience-stricken by the extraordinary nature of his plans, he turned aside from the meeting of the assembly, entered the portico, and walked up and down, waiting to see what would happen. Antyllus, who was one of the ordinary citizens who happened to be making a sacrifice in the portico, saw him in this disturbed state. He put his hand on him, whether because he had heard or suspected something, or was impelled for some other reason to speak to him, and implored him to spare his country. Gracchus became still more agitated and fearful, so he's getting paranoid here now, rightly so, perhaps, right? Like a criminal caught in the act, and gave him a sharp look, and one of the party, without any signal having been made or any command given, but judging simply from the sharpness of Gracchus' look at Antyllus, that the vital moment had already arrived, and thinking to gratify Gracchus by being the first to strike a blow, drew his dagger and killed Antyllus. The tension is so high here that any spark will light the powder keg, right? This is kind of how these things work. It's how the Tiberius thing worked too. It was not like, oh, well, we've kind of tried to reach a peaceable solution. Now we must take up arms. It's like, we're kind of antsy that we might have to take up arms. And then there's this like confusion and just violence breaks out. And after that, it's just all a disaster. A cry went up. And when the dead body was seen lying there in the middle of them, the whole crowd poured down from the Capitol, fearing the same fate. Gracchus went into the forum, wanting to defend himself over what had happened, but no one would even meet him. They all turned aside from him as though he were polluted by blood. So as you reap, so you shall sow, right? If you are basically turning Rome into this quasi-mob state and you lose the favor of the people, you have no recourse in the laws, because the laws have basically been re-engineered by Gaius at this point, such that the spirit is one of just mob rule. And so now he's going to be, as Shakespeare said, hoist by his own petard, exploded by his own explosion, right? Just destroyed by his own making. So the consul in the city, Opimius, ordered an armed force to assemble on the Capitol at dawn and sent messengers to summon the Senate. He himself took his place in the center of things at the temple of Castor and Pollux and awaited development. Such was the situation when the Senate tried to summon Gracchus and Flaccus from their homes to the Senate House to defend themselves, but they had armed themselves and were hastening to the Aventine Hill in the hope that if they could seize it first, the Senate would come to some agreement with them. As they ran through the city, they called the slaves to freedom, but none obeyed the call. So they're trying to get, it was a tactic used by both sides during the American Revolutionary War to say, oh, there's all these enslaved people. I bet what I can do is I can kind of offer them their freedom and use them in the war. With such support as they had, they seized and fortified the temple of Diana. They also sent Quintus, Flaccus' son, to the Senate to ask for reconciliation and the chance to come together. When they sent Quintus with a second message, the consul Opimius arrested him because by the terms of the proclamation, he no longer ranked as an ambassador. Opimius also sent his armed men into action against Gracchus and his followers. Gracchus fled with a single slave across the Pons Sublicius, that's a bridge, to some sacred spot on the other side of the river, and as he was on the point of arrest, he offered his throat to the slave. Flaccus took refuge in the workshop of a man he knew, and when the pursuers, not knowing which the house was, threatened to burn down the whole lane, the man who had taken him in was reluctant to betray his suppliant, but told someone else to do so, and so Flaccus was captured and put to death. That is the end of Gaius and also of Flaccus, but not before irreparable damage was done to the Roman state, right? This is kind of, there's much more to the story, and we're going to go on then with Sulla and with the kind of the downfall of Cicero and the triumvirates at a later time. This is not, we're kind of going to leave Rome behind now for a bit and come back to it periodically as time permits. But this, as I have stressed, is the beginning of the end, right? This is when you have people resolving their political disputes in this way, it means that they have completely lost faith in the traditions and the institutions of the state to fix their problems. What do we learn? What can we take from all of this? I'm going to first just read Mommsen's, this German historian's kind of take, as it were, on it. He says, Gaius Gracchus did not at all, as many good-natured people in ancient and modern times have supposed, wished to place the Roman Republic on new democratic bases. So this is, you hear this a lot now. You've heard it from me already, that like the people out there who are telling you they're fighting for this popular justice uprising, right? This uprising of popular sentiment are not who they say they are. They are not the people that are here to fix all your problems. They're the people who are here to rule you and make you submit. Here's what Mommsen says again about Gaius. He wished to abolish it and to abolish the Roman state and introduce in its stead a tyrannus. That is, in modern language, a monarchy, not in the feudal or of the theocratic, but of the Napoleonic absolute type, in the form of a magistracy continued for life by regular re-election and rendered absolute by an unconditional control over the formerly sovereign comitia, an unlimited tribuneship of the people for life. In fact, if Gracchus, as his words and still more his works plainly testify, aimed at the overthrow of the government of the Senate, what other political organization but the tyrannus remained possible? Dreamers, such as was his predecessor, and knaves, such as after times produced. So this is, Tiberius was a dreamer, and the people that came after were just, scoundrels, might call this into question. But Gaius Gracchus was a statesman, and though the formal shape which that great man had inwardly projected for his great work has not been handed down to us, and may be conceived of very variously, yet he was beyond doubt aware of what he was doing. If you do not give young men valid outlets for leadership, they will find invalid ones. That's basically what Mommsen is saying. This great man, Gaius, this statesman, has no way to be a statesman except by tearing things down and destroying the Roman state. This is a huge danger. It's a huge problem. And this is not like, look, there are going to be other episodes of this show about the role and value and dignity of women. This is not like some masculinist argument that I'm making here that only men have anything to contribute to anything. But I am making a politically incorrect argument that young men are the lifeblood of any political state. And as they go, so goes the world. This is, you may like this, you may dislike it. It is simply the case. And if we don't recognize it, we are actually doomed. But I believe that there is hope for us to recognize it. I'm going to read for you now a section from Abraham Lincoln's, one of his earliest speeches. It's called the Lyceum Address. He was 28 when he gave it in 1838. And this is one of the things that sort of propelled Lincoln to fame. And there's a very famous passage that I want to read because it is relevant to what I'm saying. Many great and good men, sufficiently qualified for any task they should undertake, may ever be found, whose ambition would inspire to nothing beyond a seat in Congress, a gubernatorial or a presidential chair. They're saying there's plenty of great men with just an ambition to kind of live, to sort of sit on committees and be in Congress. But such belong not to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. What? You think these places would satisfy an Alexander, a Caesar, or a Napoleon? Never. Towering genius disdains a beaten path. It seeks regions hitherto unexplored. It sees no distinction in adding story to story upon the monuments of fame erected to the memory of others. It denies that it is glory enough to serve under any chief. It scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor, however illustrious. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. This is, to me, the most crucial line, right? Because, again, there is an element here to what Lincoln is talking about that is inherently volatile. Truly great men are, dangerous. They're dangerous because they can't be satisfied with just kind of same old, same old. What that means is that your institutions, if you are a healthy state, have to include within them room for innovation and growth and expansion. I'm coming back to this theme now because I think it's so important, right? If the only way to succeed and satisfy your political ambitions in a state is to maintain the status quo, you have failed and your state will die, right? You have to have some way for the greatest among you to do great things without destroying you. So, right? Because either, look, the greatness that Lincoln is describing here, as he says, it will either emancipate slaves or it will enslave free men. It's actually kind of morally neutral, just morally malleable. But the question of it is kind of, where is this energy? Where is all of this thumos gonna go, right? Is it unreasonable, this is Lincoln again, is it unreasonable then to expect that some man possessed of the loftiest genius, coupled with ambition sufficient to push it to its utmost stretch, will at some time spring up among us? And when such a one does, it will require the people to be united with each other, attached to the government and laws, and generally intelligent to successfully frustrate his designs. Distinction will be his paramount object, and although he would as willingly, perhaps more so, acquire it by doing good as harm, yet that opportunity being past, and nothing left to be done in the way of building up, he would set boldly to the task of pulling down. Why do you think all of those thugs are out there? Why do you think that all those thugs took to the streets to loot and riot not too long ago? Why do you think that appeals to them? They're not trained philosophers. They're not schooled in the kind of like weird, hyper-elite neo-Marxian theories that animate Black Lives Matter, the organization, right? Black Lives Matter is an avowedly sort of Marxist, PhD-driven organization that is funded in many cases by like Soros money. It's just like that is such an elite endeavor, and it's not what's driving people out into the streets. And those people are also not, by the way, like inherently more vicious than you or me. They're not doing this because they're like fundamentally more evil than you or I. They're doing it because they are young men and they want a cause to fight for, right? Our leaders, our institutions are so wizened and decrepit and slow that not only can they not offer young men something to fight for and build, they don't even know that that's what's required, that that's what's needful. The absolute first thing that we must do is think about how our institutions can accommodate and encourage and give space to people, young men who want to go forth and build something new, because that all that raw energy, that raw material, that thumos, that spirit is going to go somewhere. And right now where it's going is right out onto the streets to tear down buildings and small businesses. This stuff starts from earliest schooling. Our public education system is broken in ways that I do not have time to go into even on this podcast. It would take an entire separate episode. But all that stuff that I was talking about, the toxic masculinity, this idea that like what men really need to be doing is just paring back all of their manly impulses, is something that exists at the lowest and highest levels of education. And if you think that's not a big deal, let me disabuse you of that illusion. The reason why it's important, I believe it's so important on this very podcast to offer you some part of the classical education that you perhaps have been denied, is because we don't even remember that in the classical sense, education is not about just information. It's about shaping your soul and cultivating your soul and molding people, human beings, into true and full human beings. For young men, what that means is taking that thumos, teaching them how to make it into the handmaiden of reason rather than just pure destructive force, showing them the paths toward true manhood and toward true cultivation and to going forth and building, right? This is the thing that I keep coming back to, and this is kind of that same idea from the opposite side of the coin, right? This is why I have so much hope, actually, for like Elon Musk, and forgive me, for Kanye West. Like, look, kooks, yes, both of them, but men, let them go forth, teach them, help them how to go forth, right? Don't like the reason that they're kooks is because they truly, genuinely believe in building things and getting things done. And the only avenues for them to do that are on these weird peripheral projects that do not exist within our institutions. We must think about how to reform our institutions, our major educational and political institutions, so that they accept and cultivate men and will help men to use what they have, all of their sort of spirited energy, for the good and in a way that is constructive rather than destructive of America. If we can do that, if we can learn to do that and understand that that is our problem, there is absolutely hope for us yet. And I believe that there is hope. This concludes what I have to say to you about the Gracchus disturbance and its relevance for this moment. We are going to come back to the fall of the Roman Republic lots on Young Heretics, but not, I think, right now. It will not be our next episode. We'll just kind of we'll put a pin in it there with Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus, and we will switch to the mailbag. So I love the mailbag questions that are coming in. It is really cool to hear from you guys, all of your thoughts and what you're wondering about. And here's something that is really awesome, is that a ton of people have asked me how they can learn Greek, which wow, like I so endorse that. It's, a lot of people are saying they were inspired by the Iliad episode where I read a little Greek, or they've been thinking about learning Greek, and then all of this sort of, cool, exciting discussion about the Western canon has made them more excited to do it. Totally endorse that. The practice of reading a text in its original language is something that, even on these long discussions in these kind of wonderful conversations that we're having about ancient literature, even here, I can't give you what it's like to encounter a text face to face in its original language. You have to go out. It's not just a bunch of new words that you're learning. It's a separate way of looking at the world, because your language and the words that you put on things shape the way that you understand what you're describing. And if it's always expansive. It always expands your mind to do so to sort of learn a new language and learn a new way of looking at the world. It's particularly helpful, I think, to do so with languages that stand at the root of your civilization, and Greek is certainly one. It is a hard language. Greek is tough. It's not as tough as Hebrew, I don't think, for native English speakers, but it's certainly tougher than Latin, which is another language that I do recommend learning. But there are a lot of rewards to learning Greek specifically, because not only do you get Attic sort of literature and the literature of the High Classical period and thereafter, and also before, you get Homer, right? You can read Homer, but you also get the New Testament. You get the Bible, which is also in a form of Greek called koine, which is kind of it's a little bit pared down, a little bit more, it literally means common Greek. So the caveat here is that there are a lot of different types of ancient Greek. I mean, there are a lot of different types of English, right? We speak English in a lot of different ways in different places at different times and so forth. English changes, we change. But in the ancient world, there were even fewer ways of standardizing that, right? There was less mass communication. There were fewer kind of outlets for people to communicate across time and space. And that means that you get a ton of just radically variant forms of Greek. Attic Greek is what we call it when we talk about that kind of, that Athenian high classical period. Koine Greek is the biblical Greek, and there are a number of others as well. My recommendation to you first is to start with Koine. A lot of people that are asking me this, not all of the people, but a lot of people that are asking me this are wanting to read the Bible. So that's the obvious first protocol call. But even if you're not specifically wanting to read the Bible, I do suggest starting with Koine, because it's sort of simpler and more straightforward, and you can build up from there to wherever you want to go, to Attic, for example, or to Homeric Greek, which is, again, a sort of slightly separate thing. So the guy that I always recommend is Bill Mounts. He has a website, billmounts.com, and the resources that he's produced, there's flashcards, there's computer programs, there's obviously books and workbooks. If you're learning on your own, that is like my first recommendation. I really think it's great. My dad, whom a lot of you know from his own show, the Andrew Klavan Show, my dad will not tell you this a lot, but he learned Greek from Bill Mounts, and I watched him do it. It's very impressive, and it's totally feasible. So that's my recommendation. Bill Mounts. Go seek him out if you want to learn Greek, and I do heartily recommend learning Greek. Come back to me with more mailbag questions if you want similar recommendations for Hebrew or Latin or whatever. All right, that's the end of this episode. If you like this show, I heartily recommend that you also check out the Claremont Institute, which is where I work. They are my employers. They're very, very generous toward me in sort of supporting me as I do this side project. And the work that we do, I humbly propose, is awesome. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. You can go to either of those to read some of the most interesting writing around, even if you're not a conservative. There's a lot to chew on there. So I recommend that. Also, if you feel inspired to donate to us, you can go to claremont.org/donate. We always really appreciate that. And you can tell them in the notes that we sent you there. Say that you heard about it from Young Heretics. All right, that's it for now. Thank you all so much for being here. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.